The screaming started again at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, just as Emma was finishing her homework at the kitchen table. She'd learned to recognize the warning signs: her father's truck pulling into the driveway faster than usual, the aggressive slam of the car door, the heavy footsteps crossing the porch. Her mother's voice would follow moments later, tight and defensive, asking what was wrong. And then it would begin. The crescendo of accusations, the sharp words that cut like glass, the sound of things being thrown. Emma was 8 years old, and she'd learned that 8-year-olds didn't have much power in a falling-apart marriage. She had no control over the screaming, no ability to stop the tears that came to her eyes, no way to make her father's anger go away or convince her mother that everything would be okay. So she did what she always did. She closed her bedroom door, pulled her blanket over her head, and waited for the storm to pass. Sometimes it lasted an hour. Sometimes it lasted all night. Her name was Emma Martinez, and her childhood was being dismantled piece by piece. Sarah, Emma's mother, had tried everything to salvage the marriage. She'd suggested counseling, which Mark, Emma's father, dismissed as unnecessary. She proposed taking a vacation. Hopping time together would reignite something that had died between them. She'd even tried making Mark's favorite meals, ironing his shirts perfectly, asking about his day with genuine interest. Nothing worked. The rift between them had become a chasm, and Emma was caught in the middle, watching the two people she loved most destroy each other with words and silences. By the time the divorce was finalized 3 months later, Emma had changed. Where once she'd been a bubbly child who raised her hand constantly in class and drew colorful pictures, she'd become quiet and withdrawn. Her second-grade teacher, Mrs., noticed first. Emma wasn't participating in group activities. She sat alone at lunch. Her artwork had become dark: gray skis, trees without leaves, houses with no windows. Mrs. called Sarah for a conference, her concern evident in the worried furrow of her brow. "I'm noticing some behavioral changes," Mrs. had said gently, sliding a folder of Emma's drawings across her desk. "Has anything significant happened at home?" Sarah felt her face flush with shame. Of course something significant had happened. Her family had exploded. Her daughter had watched it happen. And now the evidence was sitting right in front of her in the form of crayon drawings that looked like they came from a deeply sad child. That conversation changed everything. Sarah became determined to help her daughter heal, to undo the damage that the divorce had caused. She researched child psychologists, made appointments, and drove Emma to weekly therapy sessions. Doctor was warm and gentle, with a calming presence that gradually helped Emma open up. After 3 months of sessions, Doctor made a recommendation that Sarah had never considered before. "I think Emma would benefit tremendously from an emotional support animal," Doctor said during one of their parent-only sessions. "Specifically, a dog. Research shows that children who experienced family trauma respond remarkably well to dogs. They provide unconditional love, they're non-judgmental, and their presence activates the parasympathetic nervous system. Essentially, they calm the body's stress response naturally." Sarah was hesitant. She'd never had a dog before. What if she couldn't handle it? What if it made things worse? But Doctor was so confident, and Sarah was desperate to see her daughter smile again. Within 2 weeks, she found herself at Riverside Animal Rescue on a Saturday morning, walking through rows of kennels with Emma by her side. Most of the dogs were young and energetic, jumping against their cages, barking excitedly. But Emma's eyes were drawn to one dog in a quiet corner, a golden retriever mix, roughly 3 years old, with scars on his ears and a cautious expression. The shelter worker explained that Rusty had been abandoned in a parking lot 6 months earlier and hadn't fully come out of his shell. He was gentle with people but reserved, often preferring to sit alone rather than seek attention. Emma approached his kennel slowly. Rusty lifted his head and studied her with an intensity that was almost human. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, a scared child and a dog, both broken in their own ways, both carrying invisible wounds. Emma knelt down, not rushing, not making sudden movements. She simply held out her hand, palm down. Rusty approached the kennel door and pressed his nose against her hand. Emma's face transformed. A real smile, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen in months, bloomed across her daughter's face. "This one," Emma whispered. "I want this one." The adoption process moved quickly. Rusty came home with them on a Sunday afternoon, and something extraordinary began to unfold. It was as if Rusty understood that Emma needed him. He followed her everywhere, to school drop-off, to her therapy sessions, waiting patiently outside her classroom during the day. When Sarah picked her up, Rusty would greet Emma with gentle enthusiasm, not the wild jumping of other dogs, but a calm presence that seemed to ground her. More importantly, Emma began to change. Within weeks, she was talking more at school. Her artwork became lighter, blues and greens returning to her pictures. She started joining group activities again. Mrs. noticed and called Sarah with genuine joy in her voice. "I don't know what you're doing differently, but Emma is becoming herself again," the teacher said. But the real magic happened at night. On the nights when Emma had bad dreams, and there were still many of those, Rusty would wake before her, pressing his body against hers, grounding her, reminding her that she wasn't alone. Emma would wake gasping from nightmares about her parents fighting, find Rusty beside her, and her breathing would gradually slow. His steady presence was more powerful than any medication. Sarah watched in amazement as her daughter and this rescue dog formed a bond that seemed almost telepathic. Emma would look at Rusty, and he would sense exactly what she needed. Sometimes it was energy, sometimes it was stillness and comfort, sometimes it was simply his presence beside her while she did homework or watched television. Emma's therapist, doctor, was thrilled with the progress. "This is remarkable," she said during one session, watching Emma beam as she described something Rusty had done that day. "The research is right. This dog is helping Emma process her trauma in ways that therapy alone cannot. He's providing consistent, unconditional support." By the end of that first year with Rusty, Emma had transformed completely. She laughed more than she cried. She made new friends. Her grades improved from B's to A's. The dark clouds that had seemed to follow her had lifted, replaced by the genuine optimism of a child who'd learned that not everything fell apart, that healing was possible, and that sometimes the most powerful medicine came in the form of fur and unconditional love. Teachers stopped Emma in the hallway to comment on her brightness. Relatives noticed the change when they saw her at family gatherings. Even Mark, Emma's father, commented during a custody exchange that his daughter seemed much better. What none of them fully understood, what Sarah was only beginning to comprehend, was that Rusty hadn't just been a pet. He'd been an anchor in Emma's storm, a mirror reflecting that she wasn't alone in her pain, and a daily reminder that love, real, unconditional, healing love, could survive anything. Emma and Rusty had found each other at exactly the moment they both needed saving. And their story was only just beginning. 2 years had passed since Rusty came into Emma's life, and those 2 years had been the most stable, peaceful period Emma could remember. She'd blossomed into a confident, happy 10-year-old. She was on the soccer team, had a close circle of friends, excelled in school, and most importantly, she had Rusty, her constant companion, her protector, her best friend. Sarah watched her daughter flourish and allowed herself to finally believe that the worst was behind them. Then Mark announced his engagement. He called to tell Emma the news, his voice cheerful and casual, as if he wasn't delivering information that would change everything. His name was, and he'd met her at work about 6 months earlier. They were planning a small wedding and hoped Emma would be excited about having a new family. Emma listened politely, said the appropriate words, and hung up the phone. That night she was quieter than usual, and Rusty didn't leave her side for a moment. When first arrived at Mark's house for Emma's weekend visit, she seemed pleasant enough, professional, with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She complimented Emma's soccer uniform, asked about school, and suggested they all go out for pizza. But something felt off to Emma, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. There was a quality to his attention that felt performative, like watching someone act the part of a caring future stepmother rather than genuinely being one. The first few visits were relatively normal, maintained her facade of friendliness, though Emma noticed that her father seemed different around, more tense, eager to please, constantly looking for approval. But it was on the fourth weekend visit that everything shifted. It started with something small. Emma had left her phone in the living room and went to retrieve it, was scrolling through it, checking her messages, which made Emma uncomfortable. When Emma asked for it back, his expression hardened. "You're being rude," said coldly. "I was just looking. There's nothing to hide, is there?" Emma shook her head, but something in his tone made her stomach tighten. That night, when Emma accidentally spilled juice on his white carpet, the reaction was disproportionate. His face flushed with anger and her voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You did that on purpose," she hissed. "You're trying to ruin everything. You're jealous of me, aren't you? You want your father all to yourself." Emma tried to apologize, to clean it up, but grabbed her arm. Not hard enough to leave a mark, but hard enough to hurt, hard enough to convey the message. "I'm in control here now." When Emma returned to Sarah's house on Sunday, she was subdued. Sarah asked if everything was okay, and Emma said it was fine, not wanting to worry her mother or cause conflict with her father. But subtle changes began to emerge. Emma became hypervigilant about keeping her space clean, about not making mistakes, about being perfect in ways she'd never been concerned with before. She started having stomach aches on Friday afternoons before her visits to Mark's. She developed tics, picking at her cuticles, a nervous habit she'd abandoned years ago. Rusty noticed immediately. The dog became protective in new ways, staying even closer to Emma, seeming to sense her anxiety before visits. When Sarah would prepare Emma's overnight bag, Rusty would follow her from room to room, refusing to leave her side. 2 months into Mark's marriage, something darker emerged. During one visit, Emma made the mistake of contradicting something said during dinner, stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She took Emma's arm and led her to a back bedroom, locking the door behind them. "You embarrassed me," said, her voice cold and controlled. "In front of your father. You're a spoiled, ungrateful child, and frankly, I don't know why your father bothers with you." She didn't hit her, not that first time, but she held Emma's arm painfully tight and spoke in a way that felt worse than physical violence. The words sank into Emma's skin like poison. Ungrateful, burdened, jealous, spoiled, unwanted. Released her and left her in the dark bedroom for 2 hours. When Emma emerged, Mark was in the living room watching television. He didn't ask where she'd been. It was as if the incident hadn't happened, as if Emma hadn't spent hours in darkness with her heart racing, as if she hadn't been crying silent tears on a bed that didn't feel safe. The abuse escalated gradually, strategically. Learned what would hurt Emma most, not always physical pain, though there were occasional rough handling, grabbed arms, and one incident where she pushed Emma against a wall, but emotional cruelty. She would tell Emma that her mother was a failure, that her father didn't really love her, that Emma was the reason her parents' marriage had failed. She said these things with a calm certainty that made them feel true. Once locked Emma in the basement for part of a Saturday, telling her it was time out for your attitude. Another time, when Emma mentioned wanting to bring a drawing she'd made to show her mother, tore it up in front of her and threw it away. "Your mother doesn't care about your silly drawings," she'd said. The physical marks faded quickly, but the emotional damage was accumulating like snow in a storm. Emma became anxious, withdrawn, clingy. At school, her grades began to slip. Teachers noticed her staring out windows, not engaging in class discussions. Her best friend noticed that Emma didn't want to do sleepovers anymore. And Rusty became her emotional anchor, the only thing that seemed to keep her from completely shattering. Sarah tried to talk to Emma repeatedly, gently asking if everything was okay at Dad's house. Emma would say it was fine, terrified of causing problems, confused about whether what was happening was bad enough to report. Children often don't realize that emotional abuse is still abuse, that coercion and cruelty are serious crimes regardless of whether bruises are visible. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Friday, the night before Emma's visit to Mark's. She was already anxious, her stomach in knots. Sarah was helping her pack and Emma was sitting on her bed, unusually quiet. Sarah sat down beside her daughter and simply held her, not asking questions, just offering presence. Something in that unconditional support broke the dam Emma had built inside herself. "Mommy," Emma whispered, and her voice was so small, so broken that Sarah's entire body went rigid. "Locked me in a room on Sunday. She said bad things to me. She grabbed me really hard and it hurt." Sarah's protective instinct exploded into action. She held Emma closer, feeling her daughter's small body shake with sobs. Over the next hour, Emma revealed piece after piece of what had been happening, not all of it at once, not in perfect sequence, but in fragments that Sarah's heart heard clearly. Her daughter had been being abused. Sarah's first call was to the police. Her second was to her lawyer. By the time she hung up the phone, she had made a decision that would trigger a war. She was going to fight with everything she had to protect her daughter. Mark's lawyer called the next morning. Mark was furious. He claimed Emma was lying, that Sarah was poisoning his daughter against him, that this was a custody manipulation tactic. He refused to acknowledge that anything inappropriate had happened. But Sarah knew the truth. She'd seen the anxiety in her daughter's eyes, heard the trembling in her voice, felt the fear radiating from Emma's small body. The battle was about to begin, and Emma would be right in the center of it, forced to choose between her father and her own safety. Everything was about to change forever. The first investigator who arrived at Sarah's house 3 days after Emma's revelation was Detective James, a man in his 50s with tired eyes and a weathered face that suggested he'd seen too much of the world's cruelty. He was kind enough, speaking gently to Emma, but what Sarah understood immediately was that this process would be anything but gentle. The legal system, designed to protect children, would now put Emma through an ordeal that in many ways felt like a second victimization. "I need to ask Emma some questions," Detective explained to Sarah. "The sooner we get her statement on record, the stronger our case, but I want to warn you, this won't be easy for her. She'll have to relive what happened." Emma sat in the living room, Rusty pressed against her leg, as Detective asked her to describe what had done. Emma's voice was barely audible at first, her eyes fixed on Rusty's fur. She talked about being locked in the basement, about cruel words, about the time she'd been grabbed. Recorded everything, his expression neutral, professional, giving nothing away. But what Sarah didn't understand until later was that this first interview would be followed by many others. Child Protective Services arrived next, sending a caseworker named Ms. who was supposed to assess whether Emma was safe in her mother's care. It seemed obvious to Sarah. Emma had been abused at her father's house, not at home, but the system required documentation, assessments, and evaluations. Ms. interviewed Emma separately, asking her to describe the abuse again. Emma's account was similar but with subtle differences in details and timing. She couldn't remember exactly when certain incidents happened. She wasn't entirely sure of the sequence of events. Under the pressure of being asked the same questions repeatedly, by a stranger with a clipboard and an official demeanor, Emma's narrative became less certain. "Children sometimes have difficulty with temporal sequencing," Ms. explained to Sarah in clinical language that somehow made the trauma sound less real. "That's not unusual, especially with traumatic events. Memory can be fragmented in abuse cases." But Sarah could see the doubt creeping in, could sense that inconsistencies were being noted and filed away. The worst came 6 weeks into the investigation, when Mark's legal team hired their own investigator, a woman named Dr., a forensic psychologist with a reputation for aggressive interviewing tactics and an apparent specialty in finding false memories in child abuse cases. Sarah was told that doctor would be conducting an evaluation of Emma's credibility. Sarah's lawyer, no relation to Emma's therapist, warned her about what was coming. "She's going to be harsh," said bluntly. "She'll use leading questions, contradictory statements, and pressure tactics designed to get Emma to recant or to reveal inconsistencies. It's her job to discredit Emma's testimony. You need to prepare Emma for this, but also understand that no matter what she says, doctor will find a way to paint your daughter as unreliable." The interview took place in Dr. Sterile office on a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah wasn't allowed to be present, only Rusty, per Emma's request, and the investigators' reluctant agreement. Emma went in looking small and frightened, Rusty's leash wrapped around her wrist. For 2 hours, Doctor questioned Emma with an intensity that bordered on interrogation. She asked Emma to describe incidents with precise detail, exact dates, exact times, exact words. When Emma couldn't remember, Doctor suggested alternatives. "Did say you were ungrateful, or did she say you were selfish?" With each suggestion, Emma became less certain of what she actually remembered versus what she was being told she'd said. Doctor challenged every statement. "You said she grabbed your arm on Tuesday, but you also said it happened on a Saturday. Which is it?" Emma, confused and frightened, would second-guess herself, and Doctor would note this uncertainty as evidence of unreliability. When Emma emerged from that office, she was traumatized in a new way. Her eyes were red from crying. She clung to Rusty like he was her last connection to safety, and most devastatingly, she seemed to doubt herself, seemed less certain about what had actually happened to her. "I don't remember everything right," Emma whispered to Sarah that night, her voice filled with self-blame. "Maybe I'm remembering it wrong. Maybe didn't really mean it the way I thought." Sarah felt her heart break in a new way. This was the defense strategy, not to prove innocence, but to sow seeds of doubt in Emma's mind about her own reality. Over the following weeks, the investigation's momentum seemed to slow. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Robert Martinez, met with Sarah to discuss challenges with the case. Emma's statements contained inconsistencies. She couldn't remember exact timelines. The physical evidence was minimal. There were no photographs of injuries, no hospital records, no witnesses to specific incidents. It was essentially Emma's word against. And in the legal system, a child's word was considered notoriously unreliable. "We still have a case," Martinez said cautiously, "but it's not as strong as I'd like. Defense will argue that Emma is either misremembering events or that her mother is coaching her to make false accusations." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. The system that should protect her daughter seemed instead to be protecting the accused. Emma's anxiety spiraled. She developed insomnia, lying awake at night, her mind replaying the investigations, the questions, the suggestions that she might be wrong about what had happened to her. She started having panic attacks at school. Her stomach issues returned, worse than before. She picked at her cuticles until they bled. And through it all, Rusty was her anchor, the one constant in a world that had become chaotic and threatening again. Sarah made the difficult decision to stop pursuing custody battles for a while, focusing instead on Emma's mental health. Doctor, Emma's therapist, worked with Emma on grounding techniques, on understanding that her memories were real even if she couldn't articulate every detail perfectly, on recognizing that the investigation process itself was a form of secondary trauma. "The legal system is not designed with children in mind," Doctor told Sarah during a parent session. "It's adversarial. Emma has been forced to serve as the primary evidence in a case against her own father, to face aggressive questioning designed to make her doubt herself, to revisit her trauma repeatedly for people who seemed to doubt her." Emma would sit with Rusty during these therapy sessions, her hand buried in his fur, and slowly begin to understand that what had happened to her was real, regardless of whether she could perfectly articulate every detail or remember exact dates. But the damage from the investigation was done. Doubt had been planted, not just in the mind of the legal system, but in Emma's own mind about her own reality, and Mark's legal team knew it. They would use these inconsistencies mercilessly at trial, painting Emma as a confused child being manipulated by her mother. Sarah felt the weight of an impossible battle settling on her shoulders. She'd done everything right. She'd believed her daughter, she'd gone to authorities, she'd hired a lawyer, and yet the system seemed designed to fail her. The trial date was set for February, 6 months away. 6 months for Emma to continue healing, 6 months to prepare for testimony that would be one of the hardest things she'd ever have to do. And still, Rusty remained her constant companion, a living reminder that someone believed her, that she wasn't alone, that there was love that couldn't be questioned or investigated away. 6 months before the trial date, Sarah sat across from in her law office, feeling like she was drowning. The investigation had concluded, and the evidence they had was thin, too thin. Emma's inconsistent statements would be torn apart on cross-examination. Mark's legal team was salivating at the prospect of destroying her daughter's credibility in front of a jury. Sarah had never felt more helpless. "We need something," said, tapping her pen against her desk. "We need a way to stabilize Emma during testimony, to help her access her truth even when she's being aggressively questioned. Otherwise, the jury is going to see a confused, uncertain child, and they're going to doubt everything she says." That same week, Emma had her regular therapy session with Dr. Emma's therapist, Different, which created an interesting coincidence. During the session, Doctor noticed something profound. Emma had been talking about her anxiety regarding the upcoming trial, her fear of facing her father and his lawyer. Her heart rate had been elevated, her voice shaking. Then Emma had glanced at Rusty, who was lying beside her as always, and simply placed her hand on his fur. Immediately, Emma's physiology changed. Her breathing slowed, her heart rate decreased, her voice became steadier. Rusty's presence had a measurable calming effect, almost as if the dog was a biological intervention. Doctor leaned forward. "Emma, during the trial, when you're testifying and you feel scared or confused, what if Rusty could be with you?" Emma's eyes widened. "In the courtroom, can he do that?" "I don't know," Doctor admitted, "but I'm going to find out, because I think having Rusty beside you might be the difference between you being able to speak your truth and freezing in fear." That afternoon, Doctor called Emma's lawyer. "I have an idea," she said. "It's unconventional, but I believe it could significantly impact Emma's ability to testify effectively." 2 weeks later, all the key players gathered in Judge Richardson's chambers for a pretrial conference, and her co-counsel, Robert Martinez from the prosecution, Mark's defense team, Doctor, and a representative from Child Protective Services. The mood was tense, formal, and suspicious. Presented the proposal first. "Your Honor, we'd like to request permission for Emma's emotional support dog, Rusty, to be present in the courtroom during her testimony. The dog is not a service animal in the traditional sense, but extensive research demonstrates that the presence of a supportive animal significantly reduces anxiety in trauma victims and actually increases testimony accuracy and consistency." Judge Richardson raised an eyebrow. She was a woman in her 60s, known for running a tight courtroom, for following precedent, and for having little patience for what she considered frivolous requests. "That's highly irregular," the judge said coolly. "Courtrooms are serious spaces. They're not petting zoos. I'm concerned about the disruption, the precedent this would set, and frankly, whether it could be interpreted as the jury seeing the defendant, Emma, as so sympathetic that she needs special treatment." Mark's defense attorney, Richard Thornton, jumped in immediately. "Your Honor, I strenuously object. This is clearly designed to manipulate the jury's emotions. If we allow a sympathetic dog in the courtroom while the child testifies, we're essentially directing the jury to view her as a victim deserving of special consideration. It's improper and inflammatory." But Doctor was ready. She presented peer-reviewed research studies, case studies from other jurisdictions where animals had been allowed in courtrooms, and testimony from recognized experts on childhood trauma and witness reliability. She explained the neuroscience behind how animals activate the parasympathetic nervous system, reducing the fight-or-flight response that trauma victims experience under stress. The research shows, Doctor explained, that Emma's testimony will likely be more accurate and coherent with Rusty present. This actually serves the interests of justice. We get a clearer, more reliable account of what happened, not a confused, terrified child who freezes under aggressive questioning. Added the legal argument. Your Honor, numerous courts have recognized that accommodating reasonable requests for emotional support animals during testimony does not violate the defendant's right to confrontation. Emma's ability to speak clearly and accurately benefits the truth-seeking function of the trial. The defendant's concern about jury bias can be addressed through jury instructions. Judge Richardson listened to both sides, asked probing questions, and then asked them to leave while she considered. For 3 hours, she sat in her chambers, reviewing the research, considering precedent, weighing the competing interests of protecting a traumatized child and ensuring a fair trial for the accused. What many people didn't understand about Judge Richardson was that beneath her stern exterior was a pragmatist who cared deeply about doing what was right. She'd been a family law judge for 15 years. She'd seen too many cases where child victims were by the legal system, and she understood that sometimes protecting the integrity of testimony and protecting a vulnerable witness served the same purpose. When she called everyone back into chambers, her decision was measured but clear. "I'm going to allow the dog," Judge Richardson said, "but with specific conditions. First, the dog must remain calm and obedient throughout. If there's any disruption, the dog will be removed immediately. Second, I will provide jury instructions explaining that the dog's presence is for therapeutic purposes only and should not be interpreted as indicating sympathy toward either party. Third, the dog will sit directly beside the witness, not visible to the jury in a way that emphasizes the child's vulnerability. And finally, I want to see documentation of the dog's training and temperament." Richard Thornton looked furious, but he knew an argument would be futile. Judge Richardson had made her decision, and it was final. "Your Honor," Thornton said stiffly, "the defense preserves its objection for appeal." "Noted," Judge Richardson replied. When called Sarah to tell her the news, Sarah cried, the first tears of relief she'd shed in months. Emma's response was even more profound. When she learned that Rusty would be allowed in the courtroom beside her, something shifted in her. It was as if a lifeline had been thrown to her in the darkness. Over the following weeks, Sarah worked with Doctor on preparing Emma for what was to come. They practiced grounding techniques. They role-played testimony scenarios. They talked about what would happen in the courtroom, where she would sit, how she would be questioned, what the judge and jury would look like. And throughout all of it, Rusty was there. But Doctor also worked with Rusty, creating specific signals that Emma could use to communicate what she needed from her dog. A subtle hand signal would tell Rusty to press closer. Another gesture would indicate that Emma needed Rusty's head in her lap. These signals were practiced repeatedly until they became second nature, until Emma could execute them without thinking. "The jury won't be able to see these signals," Doctor explained to Emma. "But Rusty will know exactly what you need. He'll respond instinctively because you two have practiced it so many times. And when he responds, it will ground you. It will remind you that you're not alone." On the day before the trial, Emma asked to walk Rusty around the courthouse. Sarah drove her downtown, and together they walked the dog around the building, past the entrance, up the steps, around the perimeter. Emma wanted Rusty to know this place, to know where they would go, to become familiar with the energy of the building. That night Emma couldn't sleep. She lay in bed with Rusty beside her, her hand buried in his fur, and she whispered to him all the things she needed to say, her fear, her hope, her determination to tell the truth. Rusty listened with his whole being, his steady presence the only anchor in a night of anxiety. Sarah watched from the doorway, tears streaming down her face. Tomorrow her daughter would have to face the man she'd once loved, testify about abuse she'd suffered, and endure an aggressive cross-examination designed to make her doubt herself. But for the first time since all of this began, Sarah felt something shift. With Rusty beside her, Emma wasn't entirely alone. With a judge who was willing to think creatively about protecting vulnerable witnesses, there was hope. The trial would begin tomorrow. Everything, Emma's future, her safety, her ability to trust her own reality, hung in the balance. But for the first time in months, Sarah allowed herself to believe that her daughter might have a real chance to be heard. The courtroom was nothing like Emma had imagined, and somehow it was worse. It was larger than she expected, with high ceilings and dark wood paneling that made it feel like a cathedral of judgment. Rows of benches held spectators, reporters, family members, concerned community members who'd read about the case in the newspaper. All of their eyes would be on her. All of them would hear her most painful secrets. Emma sat in the witness stand with Rusty lying on the floor beside her, his head resting near her feet. Judge Richardson had been clear in her instructions. Rusty could be present, but the dog needed to be unobtrusive. To the jury, Rusty would look like a well-behaved pet, nothing more. What the jury wouldn't see was how Emma's hand occasionally found his fur beneath the witness box, grounding herself in his presence. Sarah sat in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone in the courtroom could hear it. Sat beside her, reviewing notes, her expression carefully neutral. Behind them sat Doctor, present as a support person for Emma, as allowed by the judge. Mark sat at the defense table with his lawyer, Richard Thornton. He looked uncomfortable in his suit, occasionally glancing toward Emma with an expression that Sarah couldn't quite read. Was it guilt, anger, confusion? She didn't know, and she didn't want to know. Was not in the courtroom. She was in another room, waiting to testify later, where she would undoubtedly deny everything with the same calm certainty she'd used to manipulate Emma for 2 years. Prosecutor Robert Martinez stood to begin the examination. He was a man in his 40s with kind eyes and a measured way of speaking that seemed designed to put people at ease. He approached the witness stand slowly, deliberately, giving Emma time to settle. "Emma," he began, his voice soft, "I know this is scary. I want you to take your time answering my questions. If you need a moment, just let me know. Okay?" Emma nodded, her eyes moving to Rusty for reassurance. "Can you tell me about your father's marriage too? When did that happen?" Emma's voice was barely audible at first. "Last year, I was 9. "And how did you feel about that?" I didn't know her very well. I was nervous." Martinez walked her through the early visits to Mark's house, establishing a timeline, letting her voice grow stronger with each question. He asked her about specific incidents, the pizza dinner where seemed cold, the spilled juice, and the disproportionate reaction. He let Emma describe things in her own words, never pushing, never suggesting answers. "Emma, did ever physically hurt you?" Emma's hands trembled. "Yes, she grabbed my arm, it hurt." "Can you describe that for us?" Emma described the incident, Martinez listening intently, the jury leaning forward. Then he asked about the locked basement, and Emma's voice shook as she explained how had locked her away and told her that her mother didn't care about her. "How did that make you feel?" "Scared and confused. I didn't understand why she was being so mean." By the time Martinez finished his direct examination, Emma had laid out a coherent narrative of emotional abuse, physical rough handling, and psychological cruelty. She'd done well. Her voice had steadied. The jury seemed to believe her. Sarah felt a flutter of cautious hope. Then Richard Thornton stood up. He was tall, in his 60s, with the practiced charm of someone who'd spent decades manipulating juries. He approached Emma with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile designed to look friendly while being anything but. Emma, I just want to clarify a few things you said, he began. You mentioned that locked you in the basement on a Saturday, correct? Yes, Emma said. But earlier in your testimony, you said this happened during an afternoon. Which is it? And what date was this? Emma's brow furrowed. I think it was Saturday afternoon. You think or you know. These are important details, Emma. We need to be precise. Emma felt her chest tighten. She reached down and found Rusty's fur beneath the witness box. It was Saturday, I'm sure of that. But you weren't sure a moment ago. You said, I think. That means you're not actually certain, doesn't it? I am certain, sometimes I'm not good with words. Thornton smiled that cold smile. So you're not good with precise details. Isn't it possible that you're misremembering other things as well, things that actually didn't do? No, I remember what happened. But doubt was being planted and Thornton knew it. He proceeded methodically through Emma's story, challenging each element. When she couldn't remember the exact date, he used it against her. When she described an emotion rather than an action, he suggested she was exaggerating. When she paused to collect her thoughts, he pounced. You seem uncertain about a lot of details here. Are you sure this actually happened? Or are you telling your mother's version of what you think happened? It really happened, Emma whispered. Speak up, please. The jury can't hear you. Emma repeated herself louder, but her confidence was crumbling visibly. Thornton pressed harder, his voice becoming more aggressive, his questions more pointed. Isn't it true that your mother has been coaching you to say these things about? Isn't it true that she's been putting ideas in your head because she's jealous of your father's new marriage? No, my mom didn't tell me to say anything, really did these things. Then why can't you remember when they happened? Why are your dates and times so inconsistent? Emma's hands shook. She looked at Rusty, seeking reassurance, but she needed more than just his presence now. She needed to ground herself. Her breathing was becoming rapid, her vision starting to tunnel. She felt like she was drowning. Thornton continued, relentless. You say grabbed your arm, but you have no bruises now, do you? And you never went to a doctor about these injuries. How convenient is that? How convenient that there's no physical evidence of any of this. She did hurt me, Emma said, but her voice had become small and uncertain. Did she, or did you hurt yourself and blame her? Children sometimes do that, you know. Children sometimes make up stories to get attention or to hurt people they're angry with. That was the moment. That was the moment when Emma broke. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Her throat closed. Her chest tightened. The courtroom seemed to spin around her. She could feel everyone staring at her, the jury, the spectators, her father, the judge. Everyone was looking at her and doubting her and wondering if she was lying. She'd been so brave. She'd been so determined to tell the truth. But under the weight of this aggressive, relentless questioning, under the suggestions that she was confused or lying or seeking attention, something shattered inside her. Emma's breathing became rapid and shallow. Her hands gripped the edge of the witness box. Her eyes filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She was drowning, she was suffocating. She was completely and utterly alone. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Richardson leaned forward, concerned. Sarah half stood from her seat, desperate to run to her daughter, grabbed her arm, holding her back. Even Thornton paused, perhaps sensing that he'd pushed too hard. Emma looked down at Rusty, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak, unable to continue, unable to bear another moment of this interrogation. This was the moment everything could fall apart. This was the moment the jury could decide that Emma's testimony meant nothing. This was the moment when a traumatized child faced the full power of the legal system and completely shut down. In the gallery, Sarah's eyes closed in despair. She'd brought her daughter here to fight for justice, and instead, she was watching her daughter being systematically destroyed. And Rusty, lying beneath the witness stand, felt everything Emma was feeling through the connection they'd built over 2 years. The silence stretched across the courtroom like a held breath. 10 seconds. 15. Emma was completely frozen, her eyes unfocused, her body rigid with panic. She couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She could only sit in the witness box, tears streaming down her face, while every person in the room watched her fall apart. Judge Richardson was about to call for a recess, concerned about Emma's obvious distress. Thornton was preparing to sit down, confident that he'd successfully destroyed the credibility of the prosecution's star witness. Sarah was gripping his arm hard enough to leave marks, her jaw clenched so tightly she thought her teeth might break. And then something shifted. Emma's eyes, which had been staring into the distance in panic, suddenly dropped. Not randomly, but with purpose. She looked down at Rusty, who was lying beneath the witness box, his brown eyes watching her with complete attention. For just a fraction of a second, so brief that most people in the courtroom wouldn't even register it consciously, Emma made a gesture. It was barely perceptible, just a flick of her wrist, a subtle flex of her fingers. If someone had blinked, they would have missed it entirely. It wasn't the kind of gesture that would be visible on the video recording of the trial. It was almost invisible. But Rusty understood. The golden retriever's entire body seemed to focus on Emma. He rose smoothly from his position on the floor and placed his head directly into Emma's lap, his body pressed firmly against her leg through the side of the witness box. It wasn't a casual action. It was deliberate, purposeful, protective. His weight grounded her. His warmth anchored her to the present moment, to something real and true and solid. Emma's hand dropped to Rusty's head, and something profound happened in her body. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to slow. The tension in her shoulders relaxed incrementally. Her vision, which had been tunnel-focused and blurry, began to clear. Rusty's presence was like a biological reset button, activating her parasympathetic nervous system, reminding her body that she was safe, that she wasn't alone, that she had something to hold on to. For a moment, nobody else in the courtroom seemed to understand what had just happened, but Judge Richardson's eyes had narrowed. She'd been watching Emma closely, concerned about her emotional state, and she'd noticed the micro-gesture in Rusty's response. The judge understood immediately. This wasn't a random pet action. This was a trained response. This was a child communicating with her emotional support animal using signals they'd practiced together. The jury began to notice as well. Several jurors leaned forward, their body language shifting. They'd been watching Thornton systematically dismantle a child's testimony, but they'd also been watching this child connect with her dog in a way that seemed almost mystical, as if the dog understood the child's pain at a level deeper than language. Emma took a deep breath, then another. Her hand remained buried in Rusty's fur, and gradually her voice returned to her. "I'm ready," she whispered. "I'm sorry," Thornton said, uncertain. He'd expected Emma to either break down completely or to recant under pressure. He hadn't expected her to come back stronger. "I'm ready to answer your questions," Emma said, and this time her voice was clear. It wasn't the small, terrified voice of a moment before. It was the voice of a child who'd been given back her strength by something she loved. "You asked if my mom coached me. She didn't. You asked if I'm sure about what happened. I am sure. I'm sure hurt me. I'm sure she locked me in the basement. I'm sure she said mean things that made me feel like nobody wanted me. And I'm sure of all of that because I lived it." The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Thornton, clearly rattled by this unexpected turnaround, tried a different approach. "But your dates and times were inconsistent." "I don't remember exactly when everything happened," Emma interrupted, her voice steady now. "I was scared. When you're scared, you don't think about dates and times. You think about being safe. But the things that happened, those I remember. Those are in my body. I remember how it felt. I remember what's said. I remember the dark basement. I remember how scared I was." "But without specific dates." "If someone hit you, would you remember the exact date?" Emma asked. "Or would you remember how it felt? Would you remember being hurt?" Several jurors were nodding. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Emma had found her voice again, not a smaller, frightened voice, but a clear, articulate, powerful voice. Thornton pressed forward, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Your saying locked you in the basement, but you didn't report this to anyone. You didn't tell your mother immediately. Why?" "I was confused," Emma said, and her voice carried the weight of truth. "Told me my mom didn't care about me. She told me that my dad would choose her over me. She made me feel like it was my fault. I didn't know who to trust. When you're 10 years old and an adult is telling you that everyone you love doesn't want you, you believe it. So I didn't tell my mom because I was scared. I was scared that my dad would take me away from my mom. I was scared that if I told, everything would get worse." It was the kind of testimony that only came from genuine experience. An adult coached a child wouldn't say these things. A child making up stories wouldn't have the emotional authenticity to convey these nuances. This was trauma speaking truth. "And your mother," Emma continued, her eyes fixed on Thornton now, "when I finally told her, she believed me. She helped me. She reported it to the police. She's trying to keep me safe. She's not making this up. Is real. The things she did are real. And I'm telling you about it because I don't want to be hurt anymore, and I don't want other kids to be hurt by her either." The courtroom was completely silent. Judge Richardson's expression had shifted. She was seeing something different now. Not a confused, unreliable child, but a brave child speaking her truth despite overwhelming fear and aggressive questioning. Thornton tried several more lines of questioning, but Emma met each one with clarity and honesty. She acknowledged what she didn't remember with certainty but remained firm about what she did know. She spoke about emotions and feelings rather than specific facts when specifics were unclear, but she never wavered on the core truth. Had hurt her, emotionally and physically, and it was real. By the time Thornton finished his cross-examination, his strategy had backfired spectacularly. He tried to destroy Emma's credibility by highlighting inconsistencies, but in doing so, he'd inadvertently demonstrated her genuine vulnerability and her authentic processing of trauma. He tried to paint her as a confused, unreliable witness, but what the jury had actually witnessed was a child who'd been systematically attacked and had found the strength to speak her truth anyway. Most powerfully, they'd witnessed the moment when Rusty had intervened. Even if they didn't understand the neuroscience behind it, even if they didn't know about the trained signal, every person in that courtroom understood that they'd seen something profound. They'd seen a child in crisis being supported by an animal who understood her pain at a level that transcended words. When Emma stepped down from the witness stand, Rusty stood with her, pressed against her leg. Sarah rushed forward and pulled both her daughter and the dog into an embrace, tears streaming down her face. Emma's hands were shaking and she was crying, but there was something different in her tears now. Not tears of despair, but tears of relief, of having survived, of having been heard. In the gallery, Doctor was nodding, her expression understanding. Judge Richardson was making notes, her face thoughtful. And in the jury box, 12 ordinary citizens were looking at Emma with the kind of recognition that comes when you witness genuine courage, when you see someone face their worst fear and speak their truth anyway. The signal, that tiny, invisible gesture that Rusty understood, had changed everything. And nobody would ever forget what they'd witnessed in that courtroom. After Emma's testimony, the trial took on a different energy. The prosecution called expert witnesses, child psychologists who about how trauma affects memory and cognition, about why children often can't remember specific dates and times, about how emotional support animals activate the nervous system and facilitate trauma processing. They presented research studies, case analyses, and evidence that all pointed toward the same conclusion. Emma's testimony was consistent with genuine trauma, not fabrication. Doctor was called to testify about her work with Emma in therapy. She described the signals Emma and Rusty had practiced, explaining to the jury the scientific basis for why these interventions worked. She spoke about how Emma's brain had been flooded with cortisol and adrenaline during cross-examination, creating the physical freeze response they'd all witnessed. She explained how Rusty's presence had literally changed Emma's physiology, allowing her to access her prefrontal cortex again, the part of her brain capable of rational speech and clear memory. What we witnessed during Emma's testimony, doctor, was a biological intervention. When the child was in a state of panic, her amygdala, her fear center, was activated. She literally could not think clearly. The presence of her emotional support animal activated her parasympathetic nervous system, calming her body's stress response and allowing her to think and speak clearly again. This is not psychological manipulation. This is neuroscience. The jury was riveted. They were learning about trauma in real time, understanding through scientific explanation what they'd already witnessed through Emma's brave testimony. Took the stand and flatly everything. She spoke calmly about Emma being a troubled child with a vivid imagination, suggested that Sarah had coached her, and painted herself as the victim of a custody dispute being used to destroy her reputation. Her testimony was polished, professional, and utterly unconvincing to a jury that had seen Emma's raw honesty just days before. When Mark, his lawyer, coached him carefully, and he walked a tightrope between acknowledging some of what Emma described while minimizing its severity or denying his knowledge of specific incidents. He claimed he hadn't seen being abusive, suggested Emma was exaggerating normal discipline, and reiterated that Emma's mother had put ideas in her head. But his testimony rang hollow compared to Emma's authentic emotional truth. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful. "Ladies and of the jury," Robert Martinez said, his voice steady and measured, "you have witnessed something remarkable in this courtroom. You have witnessed a child, a 10-year-old child, speak truthfully about her experience despite overwhelming fear and aggressive questioning. You've seen her break down under pressure, and you've seen her recover and speak her truth even more clearly afterward. That is not the behavior of a child being coached or making things up. That is the behavior of a child speaking from genuine experience." He walked the jury through Emma's testimony, point by point, connecting it to the evidence and expert testimony. He talked about how trauma affects memory, how children minimize abuse out of fear and confusion, how emotional support animals provide legitimate therapeutic intervention. He ended with a simple statement. "The question before you is not whether Emma can remember every date and time perfectly. The question is, did abuse this child?" And based on the evidence, the testimony, and what you have witnessed in this courtroom, the answer is clearly yes. Thornton's closing argument tried to plant seeds of doubt, highlighting inconsistencies, suggesting alternative explanations, attacking the reliability of child testimony in general. But his words seemed to fall flat. The jury had already made up their minds. They'd seen Emma's truth, and no amount of sophisticated argument could undo that reality. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. 8 hours that felt like 8 years to Sarah, who sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with Emma and Rusty. Emma held the dog's leash tightly, as if afraid that if she let go, Rusty would disappear. Sarah held her daughter, and they waited for the justice system to deliver what she desperately hoped would be justice. During those 8 hours, Sarah thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. She thought about the night Emma had finally broken down and told her the truth. She thought about the investigation that had seemed to destroy her daughter's credibility. She thought about the moment when Emma froze in the witness box, about the terror in her daughter's eyes, and about Rusty's signal, that tiny, invisible gesture that had changed everything. When word came that the jury had reached a verdict, Sarah's heart began to race. They made their way back into the courtroom. Emma sat between her mother and Rusty once again on the floor beside the gallery bench. The judge entered. The jury filed in. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Richardson asked. "We have, Your Honor," the jury foreman said. "On the charge of child abuse, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." Sarah felt her knees go weak. Guilty. The jury had believed Emma. They'd seen through's lies and Mark's minimizations. They'd understood that what Emma had described was real, was serious, and was criminal. On the charge of assault, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. On the charge of endangerment, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. 3 guilty verdicts. His face went pale. Mark looked like he might be sick. But in the gallery, Sarah was crying tears of relief, tears of vindication, tears of gratitude that her daughter had been heard and believed. Judge Richardson thanked the jury and excused them. Then she turned to address the courtroom, and her words carried the weight of someone making a decision that would echo beyond this single case. Before we conclude this trial, Judge Richardson said, I want to address something that occurred during this proceeding, something that I believe has significance beyond this individual case. The presence of the emotional support animal during the child's testimony was unprecedented in this courtroom. However, I have been presented with compelling research and have witnessed firsthand the legitimate therapeutic benefit that this animal provided. The animal did not provide special treatment to the defendant. Rather, it provided a legitimate accommodation that allowed a traumatized child to access her own memory and ability to communicate truth. The judge paused, her eyes moving around the courtroom. I am making a ruling that emotional support animals may be present during testimony of child witnesses in this jurisdiction, provided that proper documentation of the animal's training and temperament is submitted in advance, and provided that jury instructions clarify that the animal's presence is for therapeutic purposes and should not influence the juror's judgment. Furthermore, I am requesting that this case be published in legal journals and presented to child advocacy organizations as an example of how we can better serve vulnerable witnesses while maintaining the integrity of the legal process. The courtroom erupted in a buzz of conversation and note-taking. Reporters were already typing on their phones, realizing that this case had just become a landmark decision. But in the gallery, Emma wasn't paying attention to any of that. She was focused only on Rusty, her hand buried in his fur, her eyes closed. She was thinking about how this trial was over, how he'd been found guilty, how she was finally safe. Sarah pulled her daughter into an embrace and Emma cried, but these were different tears than before. These were tears of survival, of having been believed, of having justice rendered in her favor. Judge Richardson called for sentencing to be scheduled and was remanded to custody pending sentencing. As she was led out of the courtroom, caught Emma's eye for just a moment, and in that moment, Emma saw something that looked like regret or fear or perhaps the first time understanding the consequences of her actions. But it was too late for regrets, had made her choices, and now she would face them. Outside the courtroom in the hallway, reporters swarmed Sarah and with questions about the trial, about Emma, about whether there would be appeals. Sarah protected her daughter, keeping her close, shielding her from the cameras and questions. We're just grateful that Emma was believed, Sarah told one reporter before quickly moving away. And we're grateful that the judge recognized how important it was for Rusty to be present. This dog saved my daughter's life. Not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically. He gave her the strength to tell her truth. That night, as Emma lay in bed with Rusty beside her, she felt something shifting inside herself. The weight that had been pressing down on her for so long, the fear, the confusion, the self-doubt, seemed to be lifting. She still had a long road of healing ahead of her. She still had nightmares sometimes. She still sometimes flinched when an adult raised their voice. But she also had proof now. She had proof that she'd been right to speak up. She had proof that her memories were real. She had proof that she was strong enough to face her fear and speak her truth anyway. And she had Rusty, who loved her unconditionally, who believed in her completely, who had literally given her the signal to find her voice when she'd lost it. The case of Emma Martinez v. The system had become something much larger than one child's journey to justice. It had become a template for how the legal system could better serve vulnerable witnesses. It had become a recognition that sometimes the most powerful interventions came not from the law itself, but from the bonds of love and trust between humans and the animals who stood beside them. 6 months after the verdict, Emma stood in the bright sunshine of Riverside Animal Rescue, the same shelter where she and her mother had found Rusty 3 years earlier. She was wearing a volunteer badge that read Emma Martinez, Youth Ambassador, and she was leading a small group of third graders through the facility, showing them the dogs available for adoption. At 11 years old, Emma looked different than she had during the trial. She was taller, stronger, her eyes brighter. But more than that, there was a confidence in her bearing, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. She moved through the shelter with familiarity and ease, greeting the dogs by name, knowing their stories, understanding which animals needed what kinds of homes. "This is Bear," Emma said, gesturing to a large mixed-breed dog with gentle eyes. "He came here 3 years ago just like Rusty. Nobody wanted him at first because he was older, but he just needed someone to believe in him." One of the third graders raised her hand. "How many dogs are here that need homes?" "Right now we have 47, Emma said. "Each one is special, each one has a story, and each one deserves a family that loves them." Sarah watched from across the shelter, her heart full. Her daughter had transformed the trauma of the past 2 years into something meaningful. Emma had decided to dedicate her time to helping rescue animals find homes, understanding on a deep level what it meant to be abandoned and then saved by love. The shelter director had been thrilled when Emma and Sarah approached him about a youth volunteer program. "What you went through, what Rusty did for you, it matters," had told Emma. "And helping other dogs like him, that's beautiful." 3 times a week, Emma came to the shelter after school. She walked dogs, helped with cleaning and feeding, socialized the animals, and most importantly, she shared her story with potential adopters. When families came looking for a pet, Emma would talk to them about what rescue animals needed: patience, stability, unconditional love. She would tell them, without going into explicit detail, that she understood what it meant to be broken and then healed by an animal's love. "Some dogs, like some people, have been hurt," she would say, "but they can still learn to trust. They can still become part of a family. They just need someone who believes in them." At school, Emma had returned to being the bright, engaged student she'd been before abuse. Her grades were excellent. She participated in class. She'd rejoined the soccer team, where her coach had noticed a new determination in her play. Emma had learned that she could survive difficult things. She'd learned that speaking her truth, even when terrifying, could change everything. That resilience was evident in everything she did. But the healing hadn't been linear or easy. In the months after the trial, Emma had struggled with guilt. She felt guilty that her testimony had put her father in a difficult position. She felt guilt that her family had been torn apart. She had nightmares sometimes where she was back in the witness stand, where Rusty didn't respond to her signal, where she remained frozen and voiceless. Doctor had worked with Emma through all of it, helping her understand that she wasn't responsible for actions, that speaking truth wasn't betrayal, that healing wasn't about moving on quickly, but about gradually learning to live with what had happened. "You survived," Doctor would say, "and now you're thriving. That's not just healing, that's transformation." Rusty had been by Emma's side through every moment of that healing. The dog had also transformed. He was no longer the cautious, uncertain dog who'd arrived at their home 3 years ago. He was confident, secure, and had become somewhat of a minor celebrity at the shelter, where visitors often asked specifically about the trial dog, the dog who'd helped a child find her voice in court. But what was most remarkable about Rusty was his intuitive understanding of other traumatized animals. When new dogs arrived at the shelter, frightened and uncertain, Rusty would approach them with a gentleness that seemed designed specifically to calm their anxiety. Had noticed and suggested that Rusty might be a candidate for becoming an official therapy dog through formal certification. "He's already doing therapy work," told Sarah. "But if we got him officially certified, we could bring him to hospitals, schools, therapy centers. He could help other people the way he helped Emma." Emma and Sarah had looked at each other and both known immediately what they wanted to do. Within months, Rusty had completed his therapy dog certification. He now spent 2 afternoons a week at a local children's hospital, visiting patients who were dealing with their own traumas and challenges. One afternoon, Emma went with Rusty to the hospital to watch him work with a 6-year-old boy named who'd been physically abused by his stepfather. The child was terrified, withdrawn, barely speaking to anyone. But when Rusty entered the room and simply lay down beside him, allowing the boy to bury his face in the dog's fur, something shifted. "He's not scared," whispered to his therapist. "Rusty's not scared of me." Emma's eyes filled with tears watching that interaction. She understood completely what that child was feeling, the desperate need to be accepted despite everything, to be loved without having to prove your worthiness. The legal impact of Emma's case had been significant and far-reaching. Judge Richardson had published a detailed opinion about her decision to allow Rusty in the courtroom, and it had been cited in legal journals and child advocacy publications nationwide. Other judges had begun allowing emotional support animals during child testimony, citing Emma's case as precedent. 3 months after the verdict, Emma had been invited to speak at a national conference on child advocacy about her experience. At first, she was terrified. But with Rusty beside her and her mother in the audience, Emma had stood in front of hundreds of legal professionals, social workers, and child advocates, and talked about what it meant to be a child navigating the legal system after abuse. "I was scared," Emma had told the audience. "I was scared that nobody would believe me. I was scared of my father's lawyer. I was scared that I would forget what happened or say it wrong. And when I did freeze in the witness box, I was scared that I was failing everyone, my mom, the judge, the jury, myself." She'd paused, looking down at Rusty, who'd accompanied her on stage. "But this dog believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And I learned that I was stronger than I thought I was. I learned that telling the truth matters more than being perfect. And I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is speak up, even when we're terrified." The speech had been powerful, and invitations had followed, speaking engagements, media appearances, opportunities to advocate for other child survivors. Sarah had been careful to protect Emma's privacy where possible, turning down some invitations, and ensuring that Emma was always in control of how much of her story she shared. "This is your story," Sarah would remind her daughter. "You get to decide who hears it and how much you tell." With Sarah, the journey had also been one of healing. The legal process had been exhausting, and at times Sarah had doubted herself, wondered if she was pushing Emma too hard, if the trial would traumatize her further, if she was doing the right thing. But seeing her daughter thrive, seeing her transform her survival into purpose, had given Sarah the answer. The custody arrangement had been finalized. Emma would remain primarily with Sarah, with Mark having supervised visitation only. Mark had attended therapy and was slowly working toward rebuilding a relationship with his daughter, but it would take time, years perhaps, for trust to be restored. One evening, almost exactly a year after the trial, Emma sat with Rusty in her backyard, watching the sunset. She was thinking about everything that had happened, about how one decision to speak up had changed the trajectory of her entire life. She thought about the other children she was helping through her volunteer work at the shelter, through her appearances at conferences and schools. She thought about Rusty's work at the hospital, helping other traumatized children understand that they weren't alone. Rusty rested his head on her lap, the same way he always did, and Emma buried her fingers in his fur. "Thank you," she whispered to the dog, though she wasn't sure exactly what she was thanking him for saving her, for believing in her, for being the constant presence that held her together when everything was falling apart. Maybe it was all of those things. Sarah watched from the kitchen window, tears in her eyes. Her daughter, her brave, resilient, remarkable daughter, had survived something terrible and had emerged not broken but transformed. And standing beside her through every moment of that transformation was a golden retriever who understood, on some level beyond language, exactly what she needed. The story of Emma and Rusty had started as a journey of survival. It had become a journey of justice. But most importantly, it had become a story of healing, proof that from the darkest moments, the most beautiful connections could emerge. It was proof that sometimes, the most powerful forces in the world were love, courage, and the unwavering presence of someone who believed in you completely. As the sun set over their backyard, Emma and Rusty sat together in the golden light, two souls who'd found each other at exactly the moment they both needed saving, and who had learned that together they could survive anything. The signal that had changed everything in that courtroom was now just one small part of their much larger story, a story of two wounded beings who'd healed each other and who now dedicated themselves to helping others do the same. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful ending of all.